The debate was about to begin. The host, a seasoned veteran of political shows, gave a quick introduction, but the tension in the room was palpable. The cameras zoomed in on Karoline Leavitt and Senator Ted Cruz as they faced each other on opposite sides of the stage. The audience was hushed, waiting for the fireworks to begin. No one in the room needed an introduction to what was at stake. It was clear. A nationwide ban was on the table, and this debate was going to get ugly. The host gave the signal, and Karoline spoke first. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were fierce as she turned towards Cruz. "Senator, let me be blunt," Karoline began. "You're proposing a nationwide ban that would rip apart the lives of countless families, all in the name of politics. You say it's for national security, but let's be real. This is nothing more than a power grab." Cruz's expression remained stoic, but his jaw tightened. He leaned forward slightly, and in his voice was a coldness that matched his posture. "Karoline," he said, his words clipped. "You don't understand the stakes here. This country is at risk. If we don't take action now, we're putting every American at risk. A few families torn apart is a small price to pay to protect this nation." Karoline's eyes narrowed. She wasn't backing down. "A small price? A small price to pay for who, Senator? Your rich friends? The corporations that line your pockets?" She paused, letting her words hang in the air. "Don't pretend this is about national security. This is about control." Cruz's face darkened, his eyes flashing with anger. "You're naive. You think the system can just continue as it is? People like you, Karoline, are more interested in pushing your liberal agenda than actually securing this country's future." "Liberal agenda?" Karoline's voice was sharp now, cutting through the air. "You really want to go there? I'm not pushing an agenda, Cruz. I'm speaking for the people you've forgotten. The people who will lose their homes, their jobs, and their futures because of your policies." The audience was on edge, waiting for the next strike. Cruz's lips twisted into a half-smile, but there was no humor in it. He was prepared for this. "I've served this country, Karoline," he said, each word deliberate. "I've made hard decisions, and those decisions have kept this country safe. You might not like it, but this isn't about feelings. This is about what's best for the American people." Karoline clenched her fists, her breath coming quicker now. "What's best? You don't even listen to the American people. You're so caught up in your ideology you can't see the damage you're causing. Your plan? It's a disaster." The host shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had hoped for a more measured conversation, but it was clear this was no ordinary debate. The heat between them was undeniable. Cruz's eyes met Karoline's, and for a moment, it seemed like time slowed down. The words were like daggers, each one aimed to wound, to bring down the other. Karoline leaned forward, her gaze never leaving Cruz's. "You don't care about the families, Cruz. You don't care about the consequences. All you care about is your career, your power. You're selling out this country for your own personal gain." There was a shift in the room. The audience could feel it. Cruz's face flushed with anger, and his posture stiffened, but instead of retreating, he pushed back harder. "You think I don't care about this country?" His voice rose, louder now. "I'm willing to make the tough calls, Karoline. I'm not afraid to do what's necessary. You're too busy playing the victim to actually stand up for what's right. Right?" Karoline laughed bitterly. "What's right, Cruz? Is it right to tear apart communities? To destroy people's lives all in the name of security? You're selling fear, and I'm not buying it." The crowd murmured, some nodding in agreement with Karoline's words. But Cruz wasn't done. He leaned in, his voice low and dangerous. "Your problem, Karoline," he said, his words slow and deliberate, "is that you don't understand the bigger picture. The country needs strong leadership, not someone who cowers at the first sign of opposition." Karoline's face reddened, her hands gripping the podium. She was seething, but she didn't let the anger consume her. Instead, she fired back with cold precision. "You're right about one thing," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "This country needs strong leadership. But the kind of leadership you're offering? It's the kind that will divide us even more. It's the kind that will tear apart everything this country stands for." Cruz opened his mouth to respond, but Karoline cut him off. "Don't talk to me about leadership. Leadership isn't about making decisions in a vacuum, ignoring the real consequences. It's about listening to the people. And the people don't want this ban. They don't want to lose their homes, their rights, their dignity. But you?" She shook her head. "You're too blinded by your own agenda to see that." The room was electric now. Karoline's words hung in the air like a heavy weight, and Cruz knew he had to respond. But before he could speak, Karoline continued, her voice even more determined than before. You want to call me naive, Senator? Fine. But at least I'm not so blinded by politics that I can't see the real damage your decisions are causing. At least I'm not standing here pretending that a few statistics are more important than real people's lives. The host, who had been trying to remain neutral, glanced at the clock. They were running out of time, but the debate was far from over. He took a deep breath and tried to regain control. Let's take a quick break, he said, but Karoline wasn't finished. No, she said firmly. I'm not done. Not until the people hear the truth. Cruz's face hardened. He could see the writing on the wall. Karoline wasn't just challenging his policies. She was challenging his entire worldview. The stakes were higher now than ever before, and neither of them was willing to back down. The tension in the room was thick, and for a moment, there was silence. Everyone knew this was just the beginning of something much bigger. The host, trying to salvage the situation, gestured for the audience to calm down. But the tension in the room was palpable. Karoline and Cruz had only just begun, and their words had already shaken the very foundations of their political personas. The studio's lights seemed to grow hotter, as if the atmosphere itself was charged with the growing conflict. Karoline's breath came in sharp bursts, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned to Cruz again, her voice steady, but filled with a quiet fury that had taken root in her. You talk about national security, Senator, she said, each word dripping with disdain. But who are you really protecting? Your corporate donors? Your wealthy friends? What about the families, the workers, the people who have to bear the brunt of your policies? Cruz's face twisted in a smirk, his confidence unwavering. The people, Karoline? You're standing there talking about the people, but I'm the one who's actually making the tough decisions. You're too caught up in your feelings to understand the bigger picture. He gestured broadly, as if to encompass the entire nation in his argument. You're right about one thing, Karoline shot back, not missing a beat. This is bigger than me. This is bigger than you. But while you sit in your ivory tower, you forget that your policies don't just affect people on paper, they affect lives. Real lives. Everyday people are going to pay the price for your decisions. The audience shifted in their seats. Some leaned forward, eager to hear Cruz's rebuttal. Others shook their heads, already nodding in agreement with Karoline. It was clear now. The debate was no longer about politics. It was about values. And each side had drawn a line in the sand. Cruz let out a sigh, his tone condescending. I've been in this game long enough to know what works, Karoline. You want to talk about the working class? Fine. But I'm fighting for a future where they're safe. I'm fighting for a future where we aren't overrun by those who want to destroy us. His voice began to rise, the passion behind his words pushing through the polished politician facade. Karoline leaned in, her voice low but razor-sharp. And I'm fighting for a future where those same people aren't left in the dust while you play politics. Because what you're offering isn't safety, it's fear. You're using fear to control people, to make them think that this ban is their only option. Cruz opened his mouth to respond, but Karoline was relentless. She pressed on. Tell me, Cruz, she said, her voice rising now. How do you sleep at night knowing that your policies will rip apart families? How do you sleep when you know that people will lose their homes, their livelihoods, all in the name of your precious ban? Cruz's eyes flashed. His jaw clenched as he stared at her, as if daring her to push further. You have no idea what it's like to make decisions that affect millions of people. No idea what it takes to lead this country, so don't stand there lecturing me. I'm not lecturing you, Karoline shot back. I'm telling you the truth, and you know it. There was a brief silence, an uncomfortable tension hanging in the air. Cruz's hand gripped the edge of the podium tightly, his knuckles white. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, not with such raw emotion. Karoline had caught him off guard, and for a moment, he wasn't sure how to respond. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a stack of papers. He slammed them onto the podium, the sound echoing in the room. These are the facts, Karoline, he said, his voice now calm but laced with an unmistakable edge. These are the figures, the statistics. I'm not talking about feelings or emotions. I'm talking about real numbers. We need this ban. We need to protect this country from the threats we face. Karoline glanced at the papers, but didn't look away from Cruz. Numbers can't capture the pain you're about to inflict. You can't put a price on people's lives, Senator. These numbers, these statistics, They're not real. The people who will be hurt by this, they're real. She paused, her voice quieter now, but her words still heavy. And they're counting on you to make the right decision. But you're not listening. You're so wrapped up in your own agenda that you've forgotten what it means to be a leader. Cruz's eyes darkened. He leaned forward again, his face inches from Karoline's. You think you know what it means to lead? His voice was low, almost a growl. You're a novice, Karoline. A rookie who doesn't understand the sacrifices necessary to keep this country safe. You can stand there and talk about empathy all you want, but it's not enough to run this country. You need strength. You need conviction. And you need to be willing to make the hard choices, something you clearly don't have the stomach for. Karoline's lips pressed into a thin line. I have plenty of conviction, Cruz, and I've made tough decisions too. But unlike you, I don't hide behind politics when real people's lives are at stake. The words hung between them, the weight of their meaning felt by everyone in the room. This was more than just a debate now. It was a battle of wills. Karoline's pulse was racing. She felt her body tense as Cruz continued to stare at her, his eyes burning with a mix of frustration and disdain. But Karoline wasn't afraid? Not anymore. I didn't come here to play nice, Senator, Karoline said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. I came here to speak for the people you've forgotten, the ones you've dismissed in favor of political games. Cruz took a slow, deliberate breath, his posture still rigid. You think I've forgotten anyone? You think I've ignored the people? You're delusional, Karoline. The only thing I'm ignoring is your misguided populism. Populism? Karoline's voice was almost a whisper, but the anger behind it was undeniable. You call me a populist because I'm standing up for the working class? Because I'm defending the people who are being crushed by your policies? She shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. You can't even see it, can you? You're so wrapped up in your own version of what's right, you've lost sight of the real world. A world where people don't have the luxury of ignoring the consequences of your decisions. Cruz's face flushed. The words cut deeper than he expected. He had prided himself on being the tough, no-nonsense politician. But Karoline was getting under his skin, and he could feel it. He clenched his fists, the muscles in his arms taut with the effort to control his emotions. You don't know anything about leadership, Karoline. You think it's all about feeling good? About making the right decisions for the people? You're wrong. Leadership is about doing what's necessary, even when it's unpopular, even when it's hard. Then why don't you try listening to the people for once, Senator? Karoline's voice was a mixture of frustration and disbelief. Try listening to the ones who have everything to lose. Because when this ban goes into effect, it won't be you and your wealthy donors who feel the pain. It'll be the workers, the families, the communities. And they're the ones you've abandoned. Cruz's eyes narrowed. I haven't abandoned anyone. I'm protecting this country, and that's a hell of a lot more than you're doing. For the first time in the debate, Karoline's voice softened. But there was a strength behind it that was undeniable. Protecting this country shouldn't come at the expense of its people, Cruz. You're so obsessed with security that you're willing to destroy everything else. The words hit harder than anything Cruz had said, and for a moment he was speechless. The room fell into a heavy silence, the intensity between them palpable. It was clear now. This wasn't just about politics. It was personal. Both of them stood their ground, neither willing to give an inch. The debate had shifted from a discussion of policy to a confrontation of ideals, values, and the very essence of leadership. The debate had taken on a life of its own. The audience, initially divided in their opinions, was now fully invested in the fiery exchange. Every word that came from Karoline and Cruz was met with gasps, murmurs, or applause. The tension in the air had grown so thick that it seemed almost impossible for anyone to escape the weight of their confrontation. The host, visibly sweating, glanced nervously at the clock. The show was running over time, but neither side showed any sign of backing down. The cameras zoomed in on Karoline, capturing the intensity in her eyes, while Cruz maintained his usual calm, though his clenched fists betrayed his frustration. Karoline, seeing the opportunity to turn the tide, raised her voice. Let's take a look at the people who will be hurt by this ban, Senator. They're the ones who don't have a voice in Washington. They're the ones who don't have your platform, your donors, your connections. She gestured toward the audience. And yet, you're more concerned about the greater good, about your legacy, than the real consequences of your actions. Cruz's gaze flicked toward her, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. The greater good, Karoline, is something you wouldn't understand. This ban is necessary for the survival of this nation. It's not about one group or another. It's about securing a future where we don't have to live in fear of what's coming. Fear again, Karoline said, her voice thick with disbelief. You're selling fear, Cruz, and it's working. You've convinced so many that we need to sacrifice our freedoms in the name of security. But the truth is, you're just making people afraid of what's not even a threat. You think this is easy for me? Cruz's voice finally cracked, the anger he'd been suppressing bubbling to the surface. You think I want to make these decisions? You think it's easy to stand here and defend this country knowing that people like you will always find a way to tear down every decision I make? For the first time, Karoline could see the cracks in his facade. Cruz, the man who had always prided himself on his strength, was starting to show the weight of his own convictions. But instead of feeling victorious, Karoline felt something else. Sympathy. For a moment, her anger simmered down as she realized that Cruz, in his own way, was just as trapped by his beliefs as she was. But she didn't let that stop her. She leaned forward, her tone firm but resolute. This isn't about being easy, Cruz. This is about being right. And what you're doing is wrong. You're willing to tear down the very freedoms this country was built on in the name of security. But you're not looking at the long-term cost. You're not looking at the bigger picture. The audience, which had been torn between support for Karoline and Cruz, seemed to shift in Karoline's favor. She had hit a nerve. Some people in the studio were nodding, others were clapping quietly, and Cruz's supporters looked increasingly uncomfortable. Cruz, his face flushed with anger, stood up abruptly. Enough of this. Enough of your emotional nonsense. The people in this country want answers, Karoline, not some bleeding heart speech. Karoline stood as well, her posture matching his. And that's where we differ, Cruz. You think answers come from fear? I think they come from understanding, from empathy, and from real leadership. You can keep pushing your agenda, but at the end of the day, it's not about you or me. It's about the people who will suffer because of this. The host tried once more to intervene, but the moment was too charged. The audience erupted into applause and boos. The debate had transcended political discourse. It had become a battle of ideologies, each side clinging to their vision of the future. Just as the tension reached its boiling point, a voice rang out from the back of the studio, cutting through the chaos. It was a sharp, confident voice, and it stopped everyone in their tracks. I can't sit here and watch this anymore. Everyone turned toward the speaker. A tall man in his mid-40s, dressed in a sharp suit, stood at the back of the room. The audience went silent as he walked toward the podium. It was someone who everyone knew, a former ally of Cruz, once a key member of his political circle. The man's name was Jack Thompson, and his sudden appearance sent ripples through the room. Cruz's eyes widened with disbelief. Jack, what the hell are you doing here? Thompson's face was grim as he approached the microphone, his gaze flicking from Cruz to Karoline. I'm doing what you should have done a long time ago, Ted, he said, his voice cutting through the tension. I'm telling the truth you've been hiding. The room was dead quiet now. Karoline turned toward Thompson, sensing a shift in the dynamic. She had heard whispers of Cruz's former ally becoming disillusioned with his politics. But this was the first time anyone had heard him speak out so openly. I've been a part of Cruz's team for years, Thompson continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion. But I can't sit here and pretend anymore. What he's advocating for, it's not just dangerous. It's a betrayal of everything we fought for. The people who will suffer the most from this ban are the very people he claims to protect. Cruz's face darkened and his jaw clenched. You're out of line, Jack. You don't know what you're talking about. But Thompson wasn't backing down. I know exactly what I'm talking about, and so do you. This isn't about national security, it never was. This is about political survival. It's about maintaining power at any cost. The audience gasped. Karoline's eyes widened, and for a moment it felt as if the world had shifted beneath their feet. Cruz, the untouchable senator, was now facing a very real challenge from within his own ranks. Thompson turned toward Karoline, his expression softened. I don't agree with everything you're saying, Karoline. But on this, you're right. This ban isn't the solution, it's the problem. Karoline's heart raced. She knew this was the moment that could change everything. So you're saying that Cruz's plan is wrong? Thompson nodded solemnly. Yes. It's not just wrong, it's reckless. and I can't stand by and watch it happen anymore. The studio erupted into chaos. Some were cheering, others were booing. Cruz stood there, stunned, as the truth began to unravel. The man who had been his staunch ally had just publicly denounced him in front of millions of viewers. The camera zoomed in on Cruz's face, capturing the shock and disbelief. Karoline, seizing this moment, turned toward the camera. This is the kind of leadership we need in this country. Leaders who are willing to speak the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it means standing up to their own. The debate had taken an unexpected turn. Cruz was no longer just defending a policy. He was defending his entire political identity. The stakes had risen higher than ever before. As the cameras continued to roll, the future of the nationwide ban hung in the balance. The unpredictable twist had shifted the momentum, but the question remained. Could Cruz recover, or had he lost everything? The studio was charged with an intensity that could be felt in every corner. Cruz was reeling from the unexpected revelation from his former ally, Jack Thompson. His usual air of invincibility had been shattered, and now the weight of the situation seemed to press on him from all sides. His jaw was tight, his fists clenched, and he was barely holding on to his composure. He knew he had to regain control of the narrative, but it wasn't going to be easy. Karoline, on the other hand, was riding the wave of this new development, but she didn't let the moment consume her. She turned to Cruz, her voice steady but carrying an undeniable force. "Senator Cruz," she said, her gaze locking onto his, "I think this is the first time we've seen a crack in your armor. For years, you've been able to sell your policies as something necessary for the greater good. But now, the truth is out. Even your closest allies can't stand by you anymore." The words cut deep, and Cruz could feel the sting. His eyes darted to Thompson, who was still standing off to the side, a cold expression on his face. Cruz tried to push back, but his usual sharp tongue faltered. "I don't need anyone's validation, Karoline," Cruz shot back, his voice tinged with frustration. "I stand by my decisions. I always have." "Do you, though?" Karoline asked, her voice low but compelling. "Or have you been so blinded by power that you can't see the destruction in your wake? Do you even realize what you're asking of the American people? You're pushing them to the brink, and for what? To feel like a hero in your own story?" The words hit hard, and for the first time, Cruz faltered. He knew that his political life had always been a series of tough decisions, but hearing it framed like this, in such stark and personal terms, caused something to shift within him. "You think this is easy?" Cruz's voice broke through the growing silence. "You think I don't see the consequences? I've lost sleep over it. But this is what it takes to protect our future. The people don't understand the gravity of what we're facing." "I think you're the one who doesn't understand, Cruz," Karoline shot back, her voice stronger now. "You're not protecting the future. You're selling them a future built on fear and division. You're choosing control over compassion." The audience could feel the tension between them like a rope stretched taut, ready to snap. Karoline's words hung in the air, filling the studio with an almost suffocating weight. Cruz stood there, unable to find the words to rebut her. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the lights above. Cruz took a breath, his face now hardening again. He wasn't going to let her see him break. He stood straighter, regaining his composure. "I will never apologize for standing firm in my beliefs," he said, his voice cold again. "You can't change what's already been done." But Karoline wasn't done. She took a step forward, her voice quieter, but just as potent. "You may not care, Cruz," she said, "but the people do. They care about their children, their families, their lives. They care about a future that isn't dictated by fear." For a moment, the two stood there, locked in a battle of wills, each unwilling to bend. The room was alive with tension, and the debate had reached an emotional crescendo that no one could ignore. The moment stretched on, with the audience hanging on every word. But the tension in the air grew unbearable. Cruz could feel his own anger rising again. But this time, it wasn't just about the debate. It was personal. Karoline's words had struck a nerve, and he wasn't about to let her dismantle everything he had worked for. "Enough of your rhetoric, Karoline," Cruz finally snapped, his voice harsh and cutting. "You're so wrapped up in your idealistic fantasies that you can't see the bigger picture. You think the answer to this country's problems is compassion? You think that's what we need to survive? I think we need to stop treating people like pawns in your political game, Cruz," Karoline shot back, her words sharp as ever. "I think we need leaders who care about more than just their own political survival. I think we need leaders who actually understand what it means to fight for the people." Cruz's eyes flared with indignation. You don't get it, do you? This country is at a breaking point. You want to talk about compassion? Fine. But let me ask you this, Karoline. How much compassion does it take to put national security at risk because of your feelings? Karoline's eyes narrowed. You're afraid, Cruz. You're afraid of losing control. But you're so obsessed with security that you're willing to destroy the very fabric of this nation. You're willing to sacrifice everything we stand for to make sure you stay on top. Cruz's hand slammed against the podium, the sudden noise echoing through the room. And what about you? You're the one standing here with a naive little fantasy telling people to ignore the threats, to ignore what's coming. The words hung heavy in the air. The audience was visibly divided. Karoline stood tall, her face a picture of determination while Cruz seethed in his frustration. You want to know why I fight this way? Cruz continued, his voice quieter now, but no less intense. I fight for a future where we don't have to live in constant fear. You think this is easy? That this isn't tearing me apart? Karoline's expression softened, just for a moment. I get it, Cruz. I get that you're afraid, but you can't make the people suffer because of your fear. That's not leadership. That's cowardice. The room fell into an uneasy silence. Cruz's fists clenched, his breath coming in short, rapid bursts. He could feel the walls closing in on him. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure what the right answer was. And that uncertainty, that moment of vulnerability, was all Karoline needed. As the seconds stretched on, it became clear that the debate had reached its breaking point. Cruz was visibly shaken, his mask of political composure slipping. Karoline, sensing that the tide had finally turned, didn't let up. She had come too far to back down now. You want to know what real leadership looks like, Cruz? She asked, her voice steady but filled with the weight of her conviction. Real leadership is about being willing to listen, to understand, to put people before politics. Real leadership is about making decisions that help the many, not just the few. Cruz stood there, his eyes fixed on Karoline, unable to respond. The silence between them was deafening. The studio lights seemed to dim slightly, as if the weight of the moment had finally caught up with them both. You can keep pushing your ban, Karoline continued, her gaze unwavering. But in the end, it's the people who will decide what happens, not you, not me, but them. The host, seeing that the debate had spiraled into an emotional and personal confrontation, quickly stepped in. Well, that's all the time we have for tonight, he said, trying to regain control of the situation. A lot has been said, and it's clear that the future of this nation is still very much in question. Cruz stood there, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. Karoline remained calm, but her mind was racing. She had made her point. She had delivered the truth, and now it was up to the American people to decide what they wanted for their future. As the camera zoomed out, the debate was far from over. The story was still unfolding, and the impact of this exchange would resonate long after the broadcast ended. But the question lingered. Had Karoline's words done enough to sway the public, or had Cruz's resolve been strong enough to weather the storm? Only time would tell. And as the lights dimmed on the stage, the future of the nationwide ban hung in the balance.